Now, you've been a pretty strident voice in recent years, opposing Russian aggression and opposing the tactics of Mr. Putin. In your view, is it more likely than not that, as things currently stand, the Russians will make incursions into Ukraine?
Well, morning, Tom. Good morning to your viewers. I try not to be a strident voice. I try to be an accurate voice as someone who's written academically and in the sort of military arena about this. I think it is more likely than not that Putin will invade, but the purpose of Putin's deployments is not so that he can saber rattle. It's not so that he can be a bad guy. It's so that he can federalize Ukraine, so he can dismember it slowly. So he's very happy not to invade if people like the French play into his hands and force the Ukrainians to accept their side of the Minsk agreement, whilst Russia doesn't accept its side of the Minsk agreement. And the Minsk agreement was a pretty bad agreement in the first place. We can talk about that if you want. But look, in the next 10 years, Putin wants to dismember Ukraine, shatter NATO, and reorientate Russia away from the West, and for the Russians for the Russian state to become virulently anti-Western and opposed to the West. And he's midway through a lot of those things now. And I think that's not being robust. It's just actually being accurate and seeing the situation as it is. And I'm afraid those people who haven't seen that are simply foolishly naive.
Now, of course, the Prime Minister is heading across to Poland today. The Foreign Secretary is in Moscow. She follows the French President, who was in Moscow not that long ago, earlier this week. It is pretty extraordinary, the difference, the gulf that has opened up between British foreign policy, which is pretty resolute when it comes to the sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine, to the French and the Germans and the continental Europeans in general, who seem to be less resolute there. Why is that?
I would make a distinction between what the people in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia and Poland, who I think are much more robust because they see and feel the Russian threat every day. But there is a significant difference between France and Germany on one side and Britain and the US on the other. I think with regards to the Germans, they're just simply very dependent on Russian oil and gas, and that hugely ties their hands. And I think their energy policy is not only an environmental mess because they're having to rely on brown coal, which is the dirtiest form of coal of energy production. They're shutting their nuclear, and because of that, they're effectively in hock to the Russians, and they're very limited in their room for manoeuvre. With the French, it's a different case. I think the French see themselves as having a sphere of influence, and that sphere of influence is the European Union. And there's a little bit of Macron. I mean, I think it's a disastrous policy, and I think Macron is a disaster for his country personally. But I think Macron sort of somehow seems to think that we have the European Union sort of French sphere of interest and the Russian sphere of interest. And so they will carve up Europe in some sort of quasi 19th century way. And Macron seems to be pushing Ukraine to accept its responsibilities under the Minsk agreement. So federalizing, talking directly to the separatists who are all basically Russian spooks and, Russian officers out of uniform. They're not as serious. These people are all completely controlled by Russia, without the Russians then respecting their side. So effectively,
but of course,
you've got...
Mr. Macron does have some domestic problems. He's got an election in a few months' time. One of his main challenges is saying that Russia should, that France should withdraw from NATO, and the French tradition has been pretty isolationist over they've sort of withdrawn from the military command of NATO before as well. Is he just pursuing that tradition of French history?
No, I think it's actively worse, and I think Macron is undermining the alliance, and I think he is being what Lenin called a useful idiot. That he, if the Russians can get Macron to force the Ukrainians, to blackmail the Ukrainians into accepting all the elements of the Minsk agreement without the Russians effectively accepting their side, actually to get their troops out of East Ukraine, the Russians will be able to, over the next decade, to effectively start a series of civil conflicts in Ukraine and swallow up Ukraine county by county, starting in the north and the east. And that's their aim. Putin is using threat of force to get what he wants diplomatically. And unfortunately, people like the French look like they're playing into his hands. I'm afraid what Macron is doing is dangerous and very stupid.
Well, let's hope that the British show of solidarity with those Eastern European countries, with the Baltic states, with Poland, and indeed with Ukraine, will override that French sentiment.